So this is a first case study with preliminary result reporting the effect of soil grinding on above ground biodiversity loss. It's an integrated analysis of the impact of such agricultural practices on biodiversity and soil quality in Apulia region. The background is that over the last decades, Apulia has witnessed considerable form of land exploitation, mainly for economic purposes. They plant very intensive fruit orchards, and this has reduced the value of the environment. And the agricultural intensification has been implicated as one of the main drivers of the global biodiversity loss, as always, and even of the environmental changes. I'm recalling very fast the concept of biodiversity just to highlight some few points. The word biological diversity, whose short form is biodiversity, is the variability among living organisms from all sources, including terrestrial, marine, other aquatic ecosystems, and ecological complexes of which they are part. This is the Article 2 of the Convention on Biological Diversity, which was signed in 1992 during the United Nations Convention. And this opened the way of a certain number of interpretation of what biodiversity is. Even the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment decided that biodiversity needs to be protected, and that one of the aims of the biodiversity protection was in the Article 7b of the convention was signed in 1992 by many members of the United Nations Conference, and was lately ratified 1 year later. And in the meantime, different action plans and strategies for biodiversity went on. But all times strategies has been set up. In the beginning, it was not official, because biodiversity is an hard question, because if we want to take care of biodiversity, we have to plan the whole land. So there are a lot of interest around this concept. I was mentioning biodiversity because it's very important in terms of ecosystem services. Without biodiversity and all the context around, we do not have ecosystem services, starting from the provisioning, then the regulating activity, and the cultural values. The regulating activity is what we are concerned today, because we are taking care of a lot of things related to agricultural areas. So what we want from biodiversity is in the agroecological areas is that biodiversity support production. So we mainly care for the functional biodiversity, that part of biodiversity that is finalized to support any kind of human production. In order to have this kind of functional biodiversity working for us, there are different roads to be started. One of these roads is to take care of the environment and of the agroecosystem in the whole. So the background of this kind of work is related to this practice that is frantumazione, that is an estimated area of 20,000 hectares that are completely being altered. The practice is the grinding of the rocky topsoil by mechanical equipment. I will show you some pictures. These are the machines. These are the first steps of the work they do on the soil, and this is what why they do it. In the beginning, they applied the grinding of this rock topsoil in the Alta Murgia in order to improve some pasture and to crop durum wheat. But then they were stopped, and now they apply this practice that is even expensive, only in the case of intensive orchard, as grapevine is. and these are a little bit wider. So the aim of this first research was to determine the extent of the impact of such agricultural practices on the status of natural resources in order to prevent degradation, further degradation, and variation in biodiversity, quality of species and vegetation occurring after soil frantumazione. In order to do this, it's important to determine the relationship between changes in soil quality and biodiversity. And that's why, in order to fulfill our objectives, we need to have different competences, not only for biodiversity, but even for soil quality. And we had the cooperation and collaboration of Professor Pandi Struli and Gaetano Ladisa, and even for the statistical approach, where we were supported by University of Bohemia. This is just to recall to everybody what is the soil quality. For soil quality, we refer to this kind of definition, and it's related to chemical, physical, and even biological characteristics that enable soils to perform a wide range of function. The same is for Calum and al. In 19, the definition is quite old and quite well known. This is just to remind that the loss of biodiversity is mainly due to habitat change, even to pollution, overexploitation, and consequently the incoming of invasive alien species. This put the focus on the agricultural areas, because habitat change is exactly what we find in this kind of research activities. Apulia region is one of the most important agricultural regions for production of cereals, vegetables, and olive oil, and for sure is the nation's largest table grape producer. And the province of Bari is the area where we produce table grapes. The area of our research is in the province of Bari, that's Apulia in respect to the Italy. And the study area was nearby. It's the municipality of Acquaviva delle Fonti, and the special location is Parchi della Chiesa, so really a close place. This is a real picture, and it shows the disposition of the field under survey. For this survey, we need to have some point of reference. So we took into consideration different table grapevine orchards, and two different natural areas. The natural areas are here, P1 and P11, and are what is left from natural vegetation, which is in this kind of, in Italian we call them blades, because they go from the inner part of the land to the sea, and they host ephemeral rivers. They used to host ephemeral rivers, but as you can see, all the territory is highly impacted by soil greening. You can recognize the color of the fields that are white in respect to the others. So the practice here is very much spread, and we have, this is the natural areas, but it was not possible to reach it too. But this is very similar, and this is the freeway. So all our
after tomorrow, exactly.
Right. Yes, for in the afternoon. Okay. We picked up some fields around the area. We agreed with the farmers to have such kind of assessment, and we picked up fields that had different characteristics. All of them were green, as I said, two natural areas, then cultivated vineyards that were, this is the year of frantumazione, 2000, 1985, 2008, 2001. And some of these vineyards were abandoned. So we need to compare the impact of frantumazione and the impact of agricultural practices, and whether after the agricultural practice have been stopped, what happened to this vineyard, either in terms of soil quality, either in terms of biodiversity. And so we picked up 4 of them that were abandoned in different years. Was abandoned during the first crisis of the price of the grapevine, or the table grapevine, in 1988. This is in 1986, somewhere around the same. This is in 1999, and this in 2001. So this was the grinding, was the abandonment. And so we have different things to be taken in consideration. So the point of reference were these natural areas that are mainly with the Mediterranean mekis, and but even in this natural area, given the context of the land, we do not have an high quality of vegetation and of flora. We have what is remained of this high quality vegetation and flora. And I will tell you later on about this. And as for the cultivated vineyard, I will show you some pictures. These are the soil profile of the natural areas. This is the form. This is the other soil profile. This is a cultivated vineyard. The form, the corresponding. I just show you 3 types as a sample. And this is an abandoned vineyard. If we go a little bit on, I will show you. This is the natural area. And these are the vineyards. This is a cultivated vineyard right before the harvest. As you can see, biodiversity there, except from the grapevine, is very, very low, because they keep the soil bare. This is a grinded vineyard, and usually the soil appears like this. So, and this is a cultivated vineyard of many years after grinding, and this is what the soil is, because they keep the soil clean, they say. They don't even know why, but actually this is the situation. So you can imagine that between the effect of fragmentation, of grinding of the soil and everything related, we are in a very bad situation for biodiversity, and all the landscape is affected. So in these places that we choose, Professor Pandi and his collaborators made the soil profile, and data were taken. I don't know if Professor wants to say something, because I'm not...
Well, no, this is...
This is just example.
No, that is the layer that has been, you can see, it has expanded, and then are the boulder rocks below. This is a lot of skeleton here. That was also Ferrara was mentioning yesterday. This is a whole man-made horizon, fully transformed and changed from the previous. We noticed here, I mentioned yesterday, also a drastic decrease of soil organic matter, of carbon content. So a fully transformed landscape from the previous one. They go to the next picture. Here it is also more visible. You see a little bit on the upper part, about 25 centimeters, the color is a little bit more darker. And it's darker because this is an abandoned vineyard. So in those areas that have abandoned, some kind of organic material is accumulating. But below that, this is fully a layer with high content of rocks that show the grinding up to this layer. And these parts below are evidence of the hammers that they used in order to break it. So grinding goes up to here, the breaking of the layers go up to here, and then again, here it is the bedrock But as I said, the most typical characteristic is the upper part with some kind of, and this probably was the first vineyard that was abandoned sometime around 1988 or so. So
Yes.
a little bit of organic material has been accumulating. Go next. Okay, well,
Yes.
these two typical examples.
We will come back to the data
We'll see them
later.
also.
Yes, we will see some data about. So, in order to carry on this work, we picked up some parameters that are much more than this. I evidenciated the one about biodiversity assessment. We made two kinds of biodiversity assessment. One applying the method of Brown-Blanquet, the other one by Raunkier. The meaning is that usually botanists and phytosociologists apply Brown-Blanquet because their definition of biodiversity is related to the quality of flora that compose the vegetation of an area. So it relates on connecting the actual flora and actual flora composition with the natural one. So by using Brown-Blanquet method, we wanted to evidentiate the natural capital still retained in the area. But then we needed some more specific idea of what was going on in terms of community composition, flora community composition. That's why we applied the Raunkier method of sampling that allows us to have a specific contribution of the different species present and to have a better idea of the correlation between the species that are present with the different parameters of soil. After this kind of sampling method, we're used to calculate Shannon indexes that are called usually indexes of diversity and that put into correlation different aspects. The main aspect of plant biodiversity that are taken in consideration by the Shannon indexes are the main properties of biodiversity, that is the richness and the abundance of species. This is why, because measuring biodiversity is just an approximation of what we want to understand, because biodiversity means the correlation of all the living communities in a place. So it starts from fauna, arthropods, microorganisms in the soil, plant, vegetation, that is the aggregation of different plant species. And so it is very difficult to have a clear idea of biodiversity. What we can do is to act some monitoring and some surveys. Different surveys can give you an idea. The problem is that when you act monitoring for arthropods or for fauna, you have to act different action, and sometimes you don't have an idea of the stocks. Even for the animals, for instance, we have been monitoring fauna in different life projects. That LIFE is a specific program of European community that use the money coming from taxation for pollution to restore natural habitats and biodiversity in Europe. So we were involved and we had some monitoring of fauna, and for each kind of species you have a different way of monitoring. And there are places where animals go to feed. For instance, bats often go to feed in the orchards or in the olive groves, but they don't stay there for sleeping because they go in the caves. And so it is difficult to have a whole idea of what is going on, because animal moves, arthropods move, and so on. And it's very, very difficult. With plants, we are a little bit more lucky, let's say, and we can, because they stay there. But there is a kind of seasonality that we have to take care of. And so that's why we apply these methods of sampling. For the soil quality assessment, we have been sampling for soil profile with investigation and description, lab analysis of soil samples, we will see later the result, and we picked up some physical indicator indexes, some soil texture, soil depth, and chemical indicators, pH, total carbonate, total nitrogen, organic carbon, organic matter, and other parameters that we will see later. So going on, this is the Ronquier method, so that is the drawing of a square meter flame of a given dimension. The idea is that you can have a randomized or systematic sampling. Usually randomized is recommended, but when you have so small dimension of the field, you are supposed to have better data from the systematic sampling, and that's why we apply this scheme of sampling, avoiding to go in the field margin. We made different test areas of 50 square meters. And in the case of linear ecological infrastructures, like trees, hedges, and even the ecotones around the field, we apply the same by walking along the subunits by making a total of 50 square meters. Obviously, all the recorded species were in a form with abundance dominance score to each of them. This is a moment of the brown blanket method, the assessment. This is we identified the areas, but not one area, many areas. And then we gave a score to the projection of the different species canopy. Then to each presence of species is given a brown blanket code that is depending by the coverage of the species in the test area. I mean, if you have a very common species, you don't count, in this case, the number of individuals of the species, but the soil which is occupied by the projection of the canopy. This allows you to give a high value, because you have to attribute the value, even if the species coverage is minus that 1%. What does it mean? That if you have an orchid that is a very rare species, or a triton species that is not abundant but is present, and that present is the meaning of that present is the quality of the soil and of the environment.
If I can make just a little intervention, in terms of what we tried to measure as far as biodiversity is concerned, it was related to flora and not to fauna.
No, to flora,
Only to flora. And unfortunately, we didn't have also a soil microbiologist to look at soil biodiversity.
Well, we had such kind of assessment with the microbiology in Torre Guaceto, where we were 2 days ago, but we didn't have their collaboration for this kind of, but we are going to have, because we have a different project running now on this.
It's something to be done in the future.
Yeah, because we are continuing to work on this aspect. This is a short view of the natural area. As you see, you can see the maquis, the Mediterranean maquis, but it's even a natural area that is marginal. It's somehow degraded. And I think it can be useful to go directly to the result, because they are a little bit long. The first, I would like to talk about the diversity analysis. With the diversity analysis, we took care of two main components. One is derived from the Shannon index by dividing by the number of species in order to normalize the diversity according to different species. And the other one is the number of species, the simple number of observed species, even out of the sampling, because there is a difference in these two aspects. In this way, we calculated H, that is Shannon index, and this is the statistical elaboration. With blue, we identified the natural. Sorry. With blue, we identified the natural areas, and this is the index that was calculated on the patch, and this was the index when calculated on the border of the natural areas, because when we have a patch containing biodiversity of each kind, we have a border effect. Before the border, we have what we said fill margin. The fill margin has peculiar properties because it's in the between two different kind of soil cover, soil management, soil cover, any kind of soil cover that you can identify, for instance, by corrinal land cover. This fill margin act either an ecological infrastructure because of the value that ecotones have on the landscape. So they are supposed to have a higher level of diversity because everything is, the tillage of soil, for instance, does not affect too much the field margin, okay? Because it decreases the impact of everything in the field margin. So usually this field margin acts as ecological infrastructure. We apply on the field margin the same kind of sampling we apply on the ecological infrastructure, and they have higher values. That's why these are the ecological infrastructure of the corresponding fields. The blue one is the natural areas that has a high score in terms of biodiversity, in terms of age, expressed by age, and this is the corresponding ecological infrastructure. As we expected, in the case of natural areas, biodiversity inside the natural areas is higher than the biodiversity on the border because we were on the side of the road. So we have a further decrease of biodiversity. The contrary happened in the field. This is the cultivated field, the red one. So very low diversity. As we said, mainly the soil was bare. Very, very low diversity. The diversity of the corresponding field margin is higher. So the field margin acts as a stock for biodiversity. Some kind of biodiversity can be recovered, and that's why we work on the connection. This is part of the connection related to the landscape. Then we have the abandoned field, where we have an intermediate value of age, and on the field margin of the abandoned field, we have values of ecological infrastructure a little bit lower than in the field. So from these first pictures, it looks like if abandoned fields tend to recover some kind of diversity. The age value is a synthetic way to show that in the flora community on the soil, we have some kind of correlation. These are the results about diversities, that is the inner structure of the flora community. This is about the richness of species. They are exactly the same because of the calculation of the index and because even if we here evidenciate the variation in the number of species, this variation, we just can say that this is wider than the other one, but it's quite obvious. What is good to know is that even in A field, that are the abandoned one, this value is wider. So we have a higher number of species. This is the simple number of species. What we can say after this is that applying multivariate analysis by applying a simple detrended correspondence analysis to see the similarity of the field in terms of flora composition, we can identify that the flora composition of the two natural areas together with the ecological infrastructure, their border, they clusterize in the same place. Then we have a bunch here that is made of main ecological infrastructure, the values of the ecological infrastructure. This means that the patterns of flora composition are similar. They share the same kind of species in the same percentage in terms of contribution to the flora. And there are some other values, that is F5 and E5. As in the case of most of the fields, they are far from the value, but they are quite near. In this case, we have that the value of the flora composition in F5 is very far from E5. But we need to have an explanation for that, because even the F10, that is very close, for instance, to F9, if you remember the first, it's hard, I know. But anyway, we have to look for an explanation of that, because we would expect those to clusterize in this position. So we went on studying the species composition, and we made a corresponding ordination of the species to display the position, the preferential position of the species, if whether there is a preferential position of the species among the different plots and the different typologies of field. Why I show you this picture that is only a partial one? Because if I had some kind of strict correlation between the species, I would have appreciated some kind of clusterization of the different species. There is none. All the species are present there, but each species by herself. Going on, we made the same work, but crossing the species with the fields of reference. Variation is reported here according to these two axes, and we found some kind of order. There are some species that clusterize close to the natural areas. There are some species that clusterize close to the field or to the abandoned fields. So now we go on with this analysis, and grouping the fields, we can see if there are fields that are characterized by some kind of species composition. So we, in this for the first time, we identified a species composition which is almost typical of the abandoned field, a species composition that is similar to the cultivated field, and another one that is typical of the natural area. But until now, we don't know what is the species composition and why. In order to quantify the loss of biodiversity, you have to understand this. What we did as a second point is that we crossed some species to see if there are some preference in choosing to grow in the abandoned area, in the natural area, and in the cultivated. And we found out that there are some species growing in the abandoned area that do not grow in the natural areas, for instance. But no one of such species growing in a natural area grow in the abandoned one. So, this is a better picture of the story. Even if the significance is low, we investigated this aspect and we identified these species that are very different from the one who grow in the cultivated. They never grow in the cultivated area, and they do not grow. So there is a difference between abandoned and cultivated that let us think that if you, after cultivation, you abandon a field, you recover some kind of species, not of biodiversity, because there's no correlation between these species. So this could be a good thing, but actually, this is not true. If we analyze the influence of the time of abandonment on the species, we do not see any significant effect. So, time of abandonment has no effect on the quality of species. This is a pity, because we could recover if we decide to take care of the abandoned field. But this is not true. So, going back to the first picture I show you about the characteristic of the field, we can say that those fields clusterize because the species content of the natural area is similar. And so, but there is something else I will tell you later. These clusterize because they share some species, but not all. In fact, mainly ecological infrastructure clusterized very close and field clusterized after. This F5 and this E5 do not clusterize together. And we wonder why. And the solution came because if we go back, we are talking about F5. That is a cultivated vineyard. It was fragmented in 1985. Vineyard was planted in 1992. So it's cultivated for more than 10 years, more than 20 years. Other fields are cultivated for much less, 10 years or so. So as long as one field is cultivated, the difference between the flora inside the field and the corresponding ecological infrastructure increases. So the value of ecological infrastructure is higher because in the ecological infrastructures we find species that cannot found anymore in the fields. And the value of the fields in terms of biodiversity decreases a lot, as we could see from the pictures. But now we have a further thing to be investigated, that is this aspect. So we need to include in our analysis new fields that have been cultivated for different years, for a different span time, in order to investigate this effect that made the fields not so close to their infrastructure, but very far. Sorry. Okay, now we come to the environmental variety. And I will ask for the help of my colleagues. We did the analysis of physical and chemical parameters that were performed in each field. The first thing we did about the environmental variable was a principal component analysis in order to display the correlation between the environmental variables and the field. This is the correlation between the environmental variables. This is the fields that are natural fields, abandoned fields, and cultivated. As we go on, we can evidentiate that in this case, there is a redundancy analysis where the response variable are the chemical properties in order to see if the chemical properties respond to this kind of correlation. And we have a kind of response. So we know that natural areas present higher value of total nitrogen, soil organic matter, and soil organic carbon. And abandoned fields are characterized by a higher percentage of rock fragment, pH, and available phosphorus. This is the natural areas, and this is the characterization of the abandoned field. This was a first step because we need to understand what is the correlation between those environmental variables and the. After that, we identified that the composition, the floral composition, is typical for typology of fields. We are allowed to use the plants, the species, as a response variable, as if their presence is dependent on the environmental parameters. And this is what we found out, that we had some species that are typical of the abandoned, some others that are typical of the natural. None of them is common to the cultivated, even if the abandoned fields have some common species with the cultivated. So, after all, the analysis of environmental variable took on that, apart the total nitrogen, total organic matter, we lost completely this kind of species. I want to sublime something. None of this kind of species is of conservation interest. So none of the people involved in conservation is taking care of this aspect. But when we talk about biodiversity, we don't know which is the real correlation between one species and the other, and which is the function of a species in the supporting the productivity. I mean, one insect that can be useful to production, we know his cycle. But another one is supporting there are strict correlation, tritrophic interaction between the insect, the plants, and the environment. So each one of these species, even if it's not of conservation interest, can be useful to agricultural production. These are the species that more are at risk of being losing in the area. So, summarizing the botanical result, a total of 275 plant species distributed in 7 families were identified in the whole area. Of these, 95 plant species and 27 families with this percentage of distribution were identified in the natural areas. And these are the life forms, that is the evolution strategies that each plant species had to survive. And this is quite typical of the Mediterranean area. Then we have that in the cultivated field, not that kind of species, but only 25 plant species and 9 families are present. So there is a net loss. And this is the strategies of those species. These are xerophytes, many gramina, these are hemicryptophytes, and these are geophytes, that is bulbs and so on. In the abandoned field, we have 66 plant species, not too few, but just 18 families. And this is the life form, not very different from the one of the cultivated field. This is what happened in the ecological infrastructure, where we have a high number of plant species due to the action that have the ecological infrastructure. They are connecting elements, and as such, they have the property of the ecotones. They contain 2 kinds of diversity, the one on one side of the patch and the other side of the patch, but only 22 families. And this is important. And this is the corresponding. So this is the balance in terms of number of species and families, and this is a much more balanced than this one. This is related to the natural areas. Even if this is related with a higher number of species, this is a bad data. And this is about the concrete loss in terms of strategy of survival. In the natural area, we had this kind of strategy of survival that I summarized here because sometimes we speak about these things because these are all phanerophytes, but we don't know what to say. And this is because the disturbed action of the agricultural practices. So this is the net loss, and this is something as well. This is just the result. Thank you for your attention.
Okay, thank you, Jenny. Well, in short, the soil that has been grinded, I would say that never will go back to the natural condition as far as plants and also soil quality. But please, if you have any question, feel free.
I have 2 questions.
Yeah.
You said there is no evolution of the composition linked with the year of abandonment?
No, there is not evolution of the composition of flora, not correlation between one species and the other one.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. At least due to the data we have.
Okay, but I understood that you said it's a pity because there is no real...
There is not a real community. It's like if the plants are there because each of them is able to survive as a single species. There is not a developing of a correlation between the species. That's how we can infer by the value of age.
Okay.
That's the first index.
And do you have an example of a field abandoned since much more time? Because all your abandoned fields have been abandoned at the same period, more or less, between
Yes, that's why we need to investigate more. Now we are in a different project, which is a regional one, and we are having the opportunity to have different kind of assessment in different areas that have not been affected by grinding of the soil, and we are finding better values either of age, and there are much less abandoned fields in this case because they are mainly different vineyard. They have different kind of growing, and we are having values about 2.5, 3, even 3 in the field. That is quite high, and in few abandoned, because in that case we have few abandoned vineyard, we have values of 3.5 until now. But we have to go on for 2 years more before saying something. That's why these are just preliminary results to be aware of the kind of the amount of diversity we are losing.
My second question is, did you compare this result to conduct the same analysis but using the grime strategies?
Sorry?
The grime strategies data on species?
Yes, we are trying. Actually, there are a lot of classifications, sub-classification about the life form strategies of each species to survive. This is an old classification, but still very much used. That was set by Ronchia in the beginning of the 19th century. Now there are a lot of sub-classification that relate to the habit of a species, and they are very important because when you are in an agricultural area, you till the soil, you apply fertilizer, you apply any kind of chemicals, or you don't apply, and the strategy of survival of each species depends on the buds, on the bulbs, on the way how they, the dimension of the seeds, the number of the seeds. For instance, the leguminous plants are very sensitive because they have big seeds, so they need a lot of water to germinate. Graminae are much easier because they have so small seeds. They survive because they are dried up, and they come up as soon as we have the first rains. So the different strategies and the different life form are really a key point to understand which is the impact of the disturbance action on the plants. But we can only observe and collect data for now. I don't know if I answered to your question.
Okay.
Not so much has been done in the agricultural areas because the concept that biodiversity exists on the agricultural area is quite contrasted by naturalists and by biologists. When you say that biodiversity exists, you assume that there is a value to that area. And biodiversity relate to correlation, not to the presence of the species. That's why even if we have 106 species, has no value if you don't have a high level of correlation between them. They are not stable. They are there because they correlate with the environmental variables, not because they create some kind of correlation between them to survive. So this is the situation of most agricultural areas. But there are some cases where the situation is different. This kind of correlation is quite high, and species co-evolve because of the presence of man. And this is something completely different from natural vegetation. This is an anthropic vegetation, but has anyway a value because it supports production anyway. And so we need to work because this kind of biodiversity goes ahead, because maybe is the one we need to increase the resilience of the agroecosystem, not the ecosystem. We do not work on the closed part of the natural areas, only on the agriculture. In that case, they have biologists and naturalists.
Eduardo, yes, please.
I wonder why you call those areas as a natural area. I think that there isn't anything natural there. Maybe I would also call is a technique, a sort of reclamation of severely degraded areas. Because if you talk with people here in Apulia region, I've been talking with them for many times, and they rather consider this technique as a sort of reclamation of otherwise sterile areas, bare outcrops of rocks. And I also, below a scientific point of view, I wonder if you consider the history of the so-called natural area, because maybe there were fires, wildfires there. Maybe there were some sort of extensive cultivation or pasture or many other factors that could have affected the vegetation cover.
Well, actually, we call them natural areas because they were not cultivated. In any case, they were not touched by cultivation. There is a part of this area which is cultivated, and we will see tomorrow, but we didn't mention there. We call marginal areas because they are very small. The process of species isolation and of genetic loss and genetic erosion related to the variability of the species is quite high in that case, but I didn't mention because I have no ready data about that. It's very difficult to work with different competencies in order to assess the extent of the isolation from a genetic point of view of the species. That's why the species that are present there are usually quite common species, but the few threatened species were found in the natural areas. And the reason why we call, and we continue to call natural areas, is that the species and the kind of vegetation that is present there is peculiar of the natural area. You cannot find it either in cultivated field, either in the rest of the agroecosystem, even in the connections element of the landscape. It's present only there, although the situation is very bad. As for the question of reclaiming land by soil grinding, yes, in the beginning of soil grinding story, it could be a sort of reclamation, land reclamation of the pasture that were on the Alta Murgia in terms of history of the territory. But now, I think we should stop, because I'm not an expert, but I think that they are affecting the hydrological balance of all the region. I'm not an expert, but when I see such changes, impressive changes in the vegetation and in the flora composition, well, it comes to mind that there is some balance, more important balance, that is changing too. And the extent of the practice is not the losing of 10 species or 100 species, is that they were there in order to assure a certain balance. I can do my job, and I can say that when I look to other situations, this situation is quite worrying. But I don't know, I have no means to understand by myself the extent of the risk of that.
Well, if I can add, Eduardo, the difference between natural and cultivated area is that those two spots that we found were, as far as we can say, they were never ever used for growing any kind of crop. They were in their natural condition. Okay, fire occurred often, but somehow the vegetation has recovered as it more or less used to be. So that's what is our concept of a nature or a virgin area, which is not touched by man to be converted to agriculture. And it was not easy to find these two spots.
Either grazing. You don't think that there was grazing there?
No. Not recently.
No, there's
And
not
not-
a single animal moving around.
No, not recently. And
That has not been either used
yeah.
for grazing.
And what important, not with a big impact even in the past.
So that is now the issue of land reclamation. I mean, this is always the discussion between natural and humans. Of course, it would have been nice if they have maintained all the landscape that used to be 500 years ago. But that was the need to replace. I know similar interventions like this, IFAB even is funding this. We had a group of Syrians here 5-6 years ago, and they showed that similar techniques like this with huge machines, they are building terraces on quite slopy landscape in calcareous rocks to put fruit trees under irrigation systems. And even if that changes policy, because that looks to be too expensive, and the income that we're making were not very satisfying. Instead, here for the table grapes, it is very profitable. That's why we said that it is the market that push towards this type of intervention. Now, where we gain and where we lost, I mean, in terms of biodiversity, as Jenny was describing, there is surely a drastic loss of a variety of species that maybe they are not included even in the list of endangered species IUCN. So for a farmer, I don't care if I lost all the species as long as I have my grapes and I make my money. So this is kind of an ecological footprint on the landscape, on the natural condition of when you intervene with this. And if we go to Altamura, I'll take them, all the surrounding hills, when you go to Matera, they have been grinded all over the place. This is not land reclamation in our view. You have increased erosion there.
Even because after that, they abandoned, because they were marginal anyway.
So you never recover the original
that's the point.
pastures mixed with rock outcrops as they used to be. There are still here and there some patches that remain intact, but other than that, that is depressive. And also Ferrara was saying yesterday that, and we fully disagree that why should we grind everything all over the place, especially in the sloping lands. Because, as I said, it was also due to subsidies that for the Turu, the EU policies were supporting that type of intervention. So it's a very debatable issue, whether it's land reclamation, whether you provide income, whether that income for those cereal growers is good enough to make their living, or whether it probably was better to graze these areas rather than go and grind all over the place. Maybe the state of grape growers that put their own money and they make a good profit out of that, for them probably is viable economically. And they just forget about how the biodiversity and natural habitats were before intervening. So it's a very debatable.
Another issue we are working on since I think it's now 8 years or more is the correlation between the values of biodiversity that are that describe the structure and the correlation between the species and the landscape. In 2008, we have been publishing with the ISPRA in Rome, not ISPRA, a methodology to correlate those aspects for the evaluation of biodiversity. And but much before, I've been monitoring some farms, even in the Altamura area, not in the area of Altamura, but in the area of Gravina, that is bordering the Basilicata, the other region, and has at the center the park, a big park. And even there, the situation is a little bit better because of the presence of this park. But as long as you go around, situation is terrible. And if you make a landscape analysis by taking into consideration some landscape elements, as the dimension of the patches, the kind of patches, the land use and the connection elements, and so on, the situation drastically changes from the protected area and immediate part to the other part that are being grinding.